Dark Souls 3 is a game that I was very excited to play after finally getting all of the achievements in Dark Souls 2. It's a critically acclaimed success, and prior to Elden Ring's release, it was seen as the pinnacle of the Soulsborne series by fromsoftware. Even after Elden Ring's release, some say that this game is still the best FromSoft game ever made. Released all the way back in 2016, this game was the conclusion to the Dark Souls series, and as such has several nods to the previous two games. Some are very subtle, and others not so much. At the end of the day, one thing that's for certain with these games is that you'll eventually have the words "You died" printed on your screen. After playing through the game and getting all of the achievements, I honestly don't know how to feel about this game. Like every other game, there were certain things that I liked and certain things that I disliked. Overall, I'd say the positives outweigh the negatives, and with that logic, I should like the game, but I just don't know. Anyway, let's not get bogged down with whether or not I like the game, and let's actually talk about the experience of playing Dark Souls 3. As usual, we start with our character creation screen. Now if you've been around, you know that I like to make some interesting characters. However, I genuinely didn't know what to do when it came to my character in this game. That being said, I just let my creative juices do their thing, and this is what I was left with. It's also worth noting, I chose the mercenary class, which might have been a mistake, but more on that later. Now on to the story. I genuinely started to read a 48-page document that I found on Reddit explaining the lore of the game, but then I remembered that I'm not a fucking lore channel. For those actually interested in a deep dive into the game's lore, I will link the Reddit post in the description because it's actually a good read, and on top of that there's plenty of VOD videos that you can watch. All you need to know for this video is that this is a Dark Souls game. Kill the lords, kill some other bosses, enjoy the scenery, die a bunch of times in between, and link the fire at the end. And honestly, I think this game does just that, and they do it very well. This is thanks to major improvements in the overall gameplay and level design. There are mixed opinions on Dark Souls 3's level design. If you go into any subreddits pertaining to this game, or FromSoft games in general, you'll get the same slop about the lack of color and the levels feeling very linear. If you ask me, Dark Souls 3's level design is the best in the entire series. The levels feel interactive and encourage exploration more than the previous two games. You've got a giant shooting down arrows, and if you actually find him, you can be his friend, which means his arrows won't hurt you. You can also tear bridges down and use them as ladders to descend to a completely new area. Speaking of completely new areas, the optional Smoldering Lake has a ballista that'll keep shooting at you unless you find your way to it in order to shut it off, and trust me, that's a lot easier said than done. It's the small things like that which make the levels feel more alive, and I think that's pretty cool that exploration in Dark Souls 3 goes beyond just finding certain items and collectibles. This is definitely going to be the longest part of the video. I first wanted to tackle movement, which is more or less a refined version of Dark Souls 2's movement system. Not sure if I mentioned it in my Dark Souls 2 review, but similar to Dark Souls 1, there were moments when playing the game just felt a little clunky. Thankfully, Dark Souls 3's movement system is much smoother and is more on par with what we have today in Elden Ring. The Estus drink animations are also much faster now, and Dark Souls 3 introduced the FP bar, which is replenished using the Ashen Estus flask. Now, although I'm not a filthy spellcaster, I think that the FP system is much better compared to the spells having a set number of casts, because in my opinion there's more freedom. And that might just be the general consensus considering that Elden Ring also uses this system. Now on to the weapons. There are 24 categories of weapons in this game. This is good for those who like to experiment with different builds, or those who simply find joy in collecting various murder devices. The best, or worst part depending on who you ask, is that none of this matters because one of the starting classes has the pound for pound best weapon in the game. Yes, the mercenary starts with the Sellsword Twin Blades. They're power stance curved swords that are so easy to use it made my first playthrough of Dark Souls 3 a joke. I didn't even bother recording my first playthrough because it was just me mowing down the bosses with these things. Small spoiler incoming, the only boss I had trouble with on my first playthrough was Dancer, and that was only because I fought her much earlier than intended, which allowed me to completely break the game's natural progression system. One may argue that if I hadn't done that, maybe I would have struggled a bit more, but I disagree simply because I had the best weapon in the world. Which is why I was worried when I made the decision to go into New Game Plus with a new weapon. It wouldn't be a Souls playthrough for me if I didn't at some point switch to a big sword that did big damage. The big sword in question was the Exile Greatsword because despite it being a big sword, it had a fast moveset. As a result, New Game Plus was also pretty easy. I even went out of my way to try some sorceries, pyromancies, and miracles, which I admittedly did not get any footage for, and those made the game even easier. I think the main problem with this game's combat is the lack of significance that poise has for both you and every enemy in the game. At times, it feels like poise is just an arbitrary stat because even while wearing Havel's armor, I'm getting stun locked by basic mobs.
Okay, I fucking get it.
Another thing I really don't like about Dark Souls 3's combat is that they just completely ignored all of the power stance movesets and critical animations from Dark Souls 2, which was arguably one of the coolest things from that game. I'm not sure why they weren't included in Dark Souls 3, but it's a shame that they're not in a game that would have greatly benefited from it. That aside, the combat in Dark Souls 3 is faster, more responsive, and in my opinion, a greater test of skill than patience like it was in Dark Souls 2. This is of course best reflected in the boss fights, as they always are in these games. My favorites being Pontiff, Lothric, the Nameless King, and for nostalgia's sake, the Soul of Cinder. These bosses, in my opinion, actually require good dodge timings for their attacks in order to maximize your attack windows, and I mean, we can't ignore that Phase 2 music for Soul of Cinder. Now there are some stinkers for bosses in this game. In my Elden Ring video, I was very vocal about not liking bosses who just shoot at you and run away, which is why I disliked the Aldrich fight because that's exactly what it was in my experience of fighting him. I also didn't like that there were several gimmick bosses in this game. You have the Curse Rotted Greatwood, where all you had to do was break the eggs, Wolnir, where you break the bracelets, Deacons, which is basically Congregation 2.0 for those who played Dark Souls 2, and Ancient Wyvern, where you just one-shot it with a plunge attack. At least Asylum Demon in DS1 put up a better fight after being hit with a plunge attack. That being said, I think this game is definitely more beginner-friendly. Like I previously mentioned, you can start with the best weapon in the game. On top of that, the level design is great, and the bosses can actually offer a bit of a challenge for newer players. The progression for the game is a lot easier to follow, and FromSoft introduced a lot of quality of life changes that make it a much smoother experience to play compared to the previous two games. I already went over the faster Estus drink animations and the introduction of the FP bar. That being said, weapon arts now use FP, which depending on the weapon is either useless because the weapon art sucks, or actually gives melee players a reason to care about FP. Armor upgrades are also no longer a thing, and honestly, I can't even recall upgrading my armor in the previous games. You also have iframes when opening doors and going through fog gates again, which makes certain runbacks a little more bearable. Firelink Shrine is a very convenient hub where the majority of vendors you need will go, and most NPCs with quests will also be there at some point. However, nothing beats Majula. The soft caps for stats in this game are similar to Dark Souls 2, where for most stats it's 40 to 60 and Vigor has a soft cap of 27. Although souls can't be farmed as easily in this game, there was never a time throughout my playthrough where I felt like I was underleveled. And the removal of the adaptability stat makes it so that dodge rolls are only affected by equip load like it was in Dark Souls 1, and you can increase your max equip load by using certain rings as well as leveling vitality. I also think that the removal of life gems is a good thing because it makes the game more balanced and it makes healing more straightforward. There's also more conveniently placed shortcuts and bonfires across Dark Souls 3. On top of that, just like Dark Souls 2, you can fast travel from the get-go. Additionally, the enemy spam in each level isn't as bad as Dark Souls 2. However, I'm not a fan of them removing some of the cool stuff from Dark Souls 2. I already went over the combat related stuff, but they also got rid of a lot of cool features like bonfire aesthetics, infinite respecs, and realistic torch mechanics. With all of the features they removed from Dark Souls 2, both good and bad, Dark Souls 3 honestly just feels like a more polished Dark Souls 1. More importantly, it feels more like a sequel to Dark Souls 1 than Dark Souls 2 felt like a sequel to Dark Souls 1. None of that matters because nothing could ever make me hate Dark Souls 2. Nonetheless, I was enjoying my time playing Dark Souls 3 until I got to the... It starts off like the last two games. You play it normally and end up getting most of the achievements. All is good. It's the remaining ones that are the real challenge. Let's start with the easier ones, such as performing every type of upgrade. All you have to do for that achievement is find the gems and the required coals and do the upgrades with any infusible weapon. The majority of the pyromancies, miracles, and sorceries can also be bought by vendors you find throughout the game. They all relocate to Firelink, and if you give them the right items, you can simply buy the spells you need. Collecting every gesture can be done in a single playthrough, and all three endings actually aren't that hard to do, even the long and complicated one. If you ask me, my favorite of the bunch has to be the Firekeeper ending because Firekeeper. So what part of the achievement grind is the one I dreaded the most? Rings. There's a lot of rings in this game, some of which are locked behind New Game Plus, and even more locked behind New Game Plus 2. Now, the best strategy for this is to ignore all of the ring collecting until you get to New Game Plus 2, since all of the New Game and New Game Plus rings will also be present. Some of these rings are hidden in the most obscure of places, and it forces players to check every nook and cranny of every level just to collect the majority of rings required for the achievement. But that's not the worst part. Notice how I said collect the majority of rings. And earlier I mentioned that the majority of spells can be purchased from vendors in Firelink. Majority does not equal all. So where do the rest of the rings and spells come from? Those are locked behind covenants, and unless you have friends to play online with, the grind for all of those covenant items offline is among the worst of any game I've ever played. And I have over 1,000 hours in Destiny 2 on Steam alone. This single-handedly ruined the game for me. I genuinely had to take a long break from Dark Souls 3 after finally getting all of the Covenant items. Some say that the worst item to farm was the Proof of Concord kept, but for me, it was the Vertebrae Shackle. I don't know why or how, but even with over 400 item discovery, these things would not drop for me. Moral of the story, find friends who are willing to help grind Covenant items. Regardless of if you do it alone or with friends, the relief of getting all of the achievements for Dark Souls 3 is the equivalent of finally using the washroom after a long drive. Now, before I wrap up this video, there's one more thing I want to talk about. There are two DLCs for Dark Souls 3, Ashes of Ariandel and the Ringed City. You can access Ashes of Ariandel pretty early on into the game. It takes place in the Painted World of Ariandel, which is similar to the Painted World of Ariamis from Dark Souls 1. The first bit is just traversing the snowy landscape while being chased by wolves and Vikings. Once you get past the big bridge, that's basically where most of your journey for the DLC will take place. It's relatively short in my opinion and only features 2 boss fights, one of them being optional. And honestly, that one's kind of a pushover, but the other is highly regarded as one of the best boss fights in the series. I'm of course referring to Sister Fried. It's a 3-phase boss fight where in phase 2 it becomes a gank fight with Father Ariandel. It's definitely quite intimidating at first, but then you remember that poise is an arbitrary stat in this game and constantly stagger her to death. And once you do that, you can head straight to the Ring City. For those who only have the Ring City, you can access it from the Kiln of the First Flame, which is towards the end of the main game. This DLC starts in the Dreg Heap. The initial traversal through it is fine, and then you get to the part where angels start blasting you from the sky. There is a way to stop them, but I said, "Fuck that!" and just hauled ass to the next bonfire. You will eventually reach the first boss fight, a 2-phase fight that starts as a gang fight and ends with a 1-on-1. You then get transported to the actual Ringed City where you get shot at and fight the most dripped out enemies in the entire game, the Ringed Knights. They're tough and got some cool weapons. I mean, just look at these power stance greatswords, that's the shit Radahn uses. And like the other Souls games, this DLC wouldn't be complete without a cool-ass dragon. I know I said that Baal is the coolest dragon, and he still is, but I gotta admit Midir is a close second. He don't even wait for the actual boss fight to start throwing hands with you. The fight itself is considered to be one of the hardest boss fights ever made, and understandably so. It boils down to the fact that Midir just hits really hard and has a lot of HP. but I love the atmosphere and the music of the boss fight. The fact that this is the only other dragon boss besides the ancient wyvern gimmick fight in this game makes this boss fight even more satisfying. If you can tough it out and actually beat Midir, you'll be rewarded with the Spears of the Church Covenant item and of course Midir's soul, which can be traded in for the Moonveil before it was Moonveil. The Spears of the Church Covenant also does something very interesting. It has something to do with the next boss fight in the DLC, which is mandatory. If you are a part of this covenant and are playing online, you can actually be the boss fight for other online players. However, I played this offline, so the Spears of the Church boss was just an NPC fight. Nothing too hard. He does summon some painted guardians to help out, but it's overall very manageable. Once you beat that boss, you can travel all the way up the stairs and interact with Filianor to travel all the way to the end of time to fight the canonical final boss of Dark Souls, Gale. Reddit likes to coin this as two nobodies fighting at the end of time, but I like to refer to this as the battle for the title of John Dark Soul. It's a 3-phase boss fight against an old dude with a big sword and a repeating crossbow. In the second and third phase, Gale becomes more aggressive and he even puts down a summoning sign for himself whenever he uses his teleport attack, which I thought was pretty cool. Although Gale's movesets are very stylish and even intimidating to some, he's actually a very easy boss in my opinion. His attacks are very telegraphed and he's got quite a few weaknesses. Surely he wasn't made to be a difficult boss fight, but rather a cinematic one for a fitting end to the Dark Souls series. Upon defeating Gale, he drops his soul as well as the blood of the Dark Soul, which you can give back to his daughter in the Ashes of Ariandel DLC for her painting. I'm not sure what she's painting, but it ain't Dark Souls 4. I think Dark Souls 3 and the DLCs are a fitting end to the Dark Souls series. If we ignore the Covenant grind, I genuinely had a great time playing this game. The lack of difficulty for me is most likely due to the experience I have now after playing through 3 of these games prior to this one, but it still remained a challenge that was satisfying for me to complete. As always, if you haven't already played this game, I highly recommend that you do. Is it my favorite game in the Dark Souls trilogy? Nope. That title still belongs to Dark Souls 2 for me. I just don't like how this game feels more like a polished version of Dark Souls 1 than an actual sequel to Dark Souls 2. They removed too many great features that were introduced in Dark Souls 2, and in a way it feels like they basically just ignored Dark Souls 2 besides a few subtle references. The faster pace, smoother feel, and convenient quality of life updates make this game the perfect start for anyone looking to get into these games. It's definitely worth the money, especially if you get the DLCs. But that's gonna be it for my review of Dark Souls 3. I'd like to apologize for this video taking so long. Like I said earlier, the Covenant grind genuinely made me take a long break from this game. Next on the chopping block is Bloodborne, another game with a lot of hype surrounding it. I'm looking forward to playing it and making a video out of it. I'm not sure when that's gonna come out, but I do plan on making other videos in the meantime. As always, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.